tonight we're most fortunate to be able to look forward to somebody who's joining us with rare and insightful vision, to look forward with somebody who brings hope tempered by realism, and to look forward by understanding both the history of progress and the social forces that drive us into the future. We're talking about Demos. It's one of the nation's leading think tanks developing ideas and action for progressive change. And it takes its name, sorry, I am like tearing up a little bit because I got a little emotional there, but it takes its name from the Greek word, the people. Its goal is an America where we all have an equal say in our democracy and an equal chance in our economy. And that is why it is a privilege for Jess Harvest to present to you tonight the Vice President of Policy and Research of Demos, Tamara Draut. Her writing has appeared, Tamara Draut. Her writing has appeared in the Boston Globe, San Francisco Chronicle, the American Prospect. Her research has been covered by dozens of newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. She's appeared on the Today Show, 2020, Fox News, the Colbert Report, and she's published Strapped: Why America's 20 and 30-something-year-olds Can't Get Ahead. And her recent book came out just last year. By the way, both books are available here tonight. It's in the same room as our auction. And I'm honored to introduce Demos Vice President and author of Sleeping Giant: How America's New Working Class Will Transform America, Tamara Draut.
Good evening. Let's see, can everybody hear me? All the way back there, you hear me? You hear me? Good. Thank you so much for that introduction, and more importantly, thank you for sharing your story. Because when we can reach out and share our stories, that's when we really make real change happen and break down so many of the boundaries that have been manufactured too often between us to keep us from seeing each other's humanity. So thank you. So I'm Tamara Draut. I am the Vice President of Policy and Research at Demos, which is a public policy and advocacy organization that is really trying to tackle political, economic, and racial inequality in our country. So I will be employed, I think, securely for the short future anyway. I'm really happy to be here for a couple reasons. One, I grew up in a steel town and in a proud union household, and later I will be getting the George and Jane Memorial Award, and that just means so much to me as somebody who grew up with a steelworker for a dad in a union household. I know the difference that unions make in people's lives. So I'm here to talk about something you probably don't want to talk about, but we're going to talk about it anyway, which is how did we get here as a nation? How in the world can we get out of this mess? But before I answer those questions, I want to say a little bit about myself because it'll give you a sense of where I'm coming from. So I grew up in what is now probably referred to, sadly, as Trump country. I grew up in Middletown, Ohio. Anybody know it? Yeah! Middletown in the house? All right. But when I was growing up, Middletown was like the epicenter of the middle class, and the epicenter of a middle class species that's pretty much extinct now, the blue collar middle class. We had steel factories, we still have a steel factory, paper mills, and a pretty robust bedroom community of professional workers who commuted to nearby Dayton or Cincinnati. So my dad worked for 29 years at Armco Steel. It's now known as AK Steel, but anybody who grew up in Middletown refers to it as Armco. My mom worked as an office manager at the local orthodontist office. Neither one of them had a college degree, but we were able to live a secure and stable middle-class life. We actually always had enough to eat. Those cupboards, if I wanted a snack, there was something in there for me to eat. We always had health insurance. My dad had a retirement plan. And most importantly, we owned our home and got to do fun family things like go on a family vacation every year to Myrtle Beach. And a big part of the reason why I'm able to stand here today with you all is because my mom and dad on working class jobs were able to pay for me to go to a state university, graduate in 4 years, with zero debt. Boy, have times changed. So fast forward about 4 decades, and that kind of widely shared prosperity really feels like a distant and nostalgic memory. Today, the United States has the highest percentage of low-wage workers of any developed nation. 41 million Americans don't have enough to eat. Today, CEOs pay themselves an average of 300 times more than their average employee. Used to be about 25 times back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Today, students expect to pay for college, including a public college with debt. And the richest 1% control 40% of the nation's wealth. Today, our society is more unequal than that period we still refer to as the Gilded Age. And yet, contrast those trends with what is right now the biggest political debate in our country: more tax cuts for the wealthy and for corporations. How the heck we're going to get rid of health insurance for millions of people in this country. So, one of the reasons why we see such soaring inequality and such widespread economic struggle, I believe, is because the working class in this country has lost its power. It's lost its moral power, its economic power, and its political power. Men like my dad sort of heaved and hoisted America into this great era of prosperity, and they were really heralded and rewarded financially and in other ways for it. But we have a new working class today, a working class that is more female, more racially diverse, and is certainly not the center of our political debate or our culture or our economy. So the question I sought to answer was, why is that the case? Why does our pulp culture, our Congress, and our economy all sort of lionize the affluent and ignore the struggling working class? So before I dive deep into hopefully answering that question to your satisfaction, I've answered it to mine, but let's see if I answer it for you. I want to talk about what I mean when I say working class. So I'm talking about the 2/3 of American workers in this country that don't have 4-year college degrees. I'm talking about the nearly half of all workers who get paid by the hour and earn less than $15 an hour. No matter how you measure working class, and trust me, academics have debated this forever, the important thing to take away is it's the majority of America. It actually always has been. About 2/3 of Americans in this country don't have 4-year college degrees. So the new working class are people like home health aides, fast food workers, retail associates, janitors, warehouse workers, customer service reps, and yes, even some of the factory workers that are still here, but sadly often working at much lower wages and without the backing of a union. So I'm talking today about, I think of a quintessential working class couple. I think of an Atlanta couple that I profile in the book, LaShawn and Michelle. An African-American couple in their mid-30s. He's a sanitation driver, and she's a home health aide supervisor. So whereas 4 decades ago, my 2 parents can raise 4 kids in middle-class security on working-class jobs, LaShawn and Michelle struggle to raise their 5 children, relying on payday loans, credit cards, and often making the very tough choice of whether they can pay the rent or fill up the grocery cart. So I asked LaShawn, what would he do if he made just a little bit more money every week? And his dream was fairly simple. He said he would like to treat his kids and wife to a dinner out or a night at the movies. The dignity and the respect that was afforded to my parents, particularly to my dad, is pretty much all gone. So let's get back to this question, now that I hope we all have a picture in our heads of what I mean when I say working class. How did the working class lose its economic and political power? So first, the who and the what of the working class changed. So the working class basically shifted from making stuff to serving and caring for people. And the who became much more likely to be women and people of color. The people who have long been treated and considered as second-class citizens in this country. And so when you have a working class that is more female and more black and more brown, that marginalized status carried over and made it easier for the work of this new working class to be devalued and overlooked. We've always had sort of a hierarchy of labor in this country. Brains has always been at the top, brawn, second, serving, third, and caring at the very bottom. Unlike the old industrial working class, today's working class clocks into jobs without the backing of a union. And that's a big reason why disrespect is now pretty much baked into today's working class jobs. Whether it's retail or fast food or warehouse, low pay, unstable schedules, zero benefits are really just the beginning. There's also just a deep cultural problem in today's working class jobs, where dignity is now as rare as a pension plan. I talked to a worker down who works at a Coca-Cola distribution center who was told by his boss when he dared to complain about some of the safety issues in the warehouse that he should just be grateful to have a job. Eric and other workers at this Coca-Cola warehouse talked to me about the indignity that greets them every day they walk in those doors and punch in. From somebody being forced to work after having a wisdom tooth removed, even though they had a doctor's notice. And if you think about it, this is Coca-Cola. This is the way one of the world's most recognizable brands, which made $83 billion in profits, treats its workers. Eric told me they treat us like something you'd step on in the grass. He said, "I'll never understand it." Arlene, an African-American sales associate at Walmart, described the way she's treated by her supervisors as, and I'm quoting, "very disrespectful, almost like a slave. I can almost relate to slavery because you don't have any rights." Rhonda, a port truck driver, told me she and other truckers are treated like sharecroppers on wheels. The culture of the workplace has changed. Without the countervailing force of unions, which raise standards for all workers, there's no brakes to stop the worst instincts of capitalism. Today, workers are viewed as costs to be minimized instead of assets that drive a company's success. But it's not just the economic system that has changed. Today's new working class goes to work in a political system where capitalism is writing the rules for our democracy, instead of our democracy writing the rules for capitalism. And that shift in, yay! We're gonna fix that. So this shift in power from big business to big labor, this shift in power from big labor to big business eviscerated the economic and political clout of the working class. And it's important to understand that it didn't just happen. It was actually well-funded, well-orchestrated, and very well-planned. So I want to take you back to sort of that period of the great post-World War II expansion, from about the 40s to the 70s. America was like booming, right? The smokestacks were billowing, cars were rolling off the assembly lines, and the people, something that's never happened in my lifetime, I can't even wrap my mind around it, but this actually happened at one point in America for those of us who have never seen this in our lifetime. The people at the lowest end of the income ladder actually saw their incomes grow faster than those at the top. I can't even wrap my mind around that. The labor and civil rights movements were pushing America to make good on its promises of equality and freedom. The consumer movement, Nader's Raiders, if anybody remembers that, were holding big corporations accountable for the safety of their products. The federal government was cracking down on polluters and expanding the safety net to include health insurance for the elderly and the impoverished. And unions represented about a third of America's workforce, organizing their members and creating a strong political bloc that gave decades of presidents the political backing for a strong and active government that took care of the working class and its people. In every presidential election between 1948 and 1964, the Democratic candidate launched his campaign with a Labor Day rally in Detroit's Cadillac Square. But in the eyes of big business, organized labor and an overreaching government were dragging down the economy with high wages and onerous regulations. They were tired of being expensive and being pushed around by all kinds of activists, labor, environmental, anti-war. A political scientist at the time said this, and this is a full quote: "From 1969 to 1972, virtually the entire American business community experienced a series of political setbacks without parallel in the post-war period." So business wasn't being paranoid, it was besieged by a great spurt of participatory democracy, and it was furious. And so big business stole a page from labor's playbook and began to organize. And the chief architect behind the rise of organized business, think the Chamber of Commerce today, was a man named Lewis Powell, who at the time was a prominent corporate lawyer and would go on to be nominated and serve as a member of the Supreme Court. So just 2 months before he was nominated by Nixon to serve on the Supreme Court, Justice Powell wrote a memo to the Chamber of Commerce, about 7-page memo. You can get it online. It's really fascinating reading. I encourage you. It's called the Powell Memo, P-O-W-E-L-L, just so you know I'm not making it up. And in this memo, he outlines a way for business to strike back. And he argues that the attack needs to be aggressive, sustained, and political. He basically was making the argument for what we see in a very, very real way today. And it didn't take long. The Chamber of Commerce, which used to be sort of back then, this is in the 70s, was kind of just a sleepy sort of trade association. They decided to take Powell's vision and implement it. What happened was the number of firms with registered lobbyists in DC and the number of corporate PACs mushroomed in the 1970s and 80s and eclipsed that of labor. Today, in the nation's capital, 24 well-heeled business lobbyists are there for each member of Congress. Big business didn't do this all by themselves, though. They also got a pretty big helping hand from the Supreme Court. In 1976 was a fundamental case that's still with us today. That's when the court decided that spending money to influence elections is a form of constitutionally protected free speech. So that premise, that money is free speech, has been used time and time again, about a dozen times by the Supreme Court, to unravel any kind of limits on campaign finance. So the result is that economic clout today is easily translated into political clout. And it really is the working class that pays the steepest price. I'm going to read to you the results, and I'm going to read you the actual quote because it's pretty stunning. An academic who studies political science wrote a great book and noted that, and here's the quote, "The preferences of the vast majority of Americans appear to have essentially no impact on which policies the government does or doesn't adopt. Sadly, when the policy preferences of the affluent and the working class diverge, the affluent win, and that disadvantage is, or political advantage, depending on your view, is most pronounced on pocketbook issues." So while America's corporate elites were getting organized and fighting back against big labor and active government, The Republican Party was also developing its own political strategy to begin unraveling the New Deal coalition and the role of government in our lives. And that strategy, which is still in full effect in operation today, was and is strategic racism. So during the New Deal and Great Society eras, white people saw government programs as helping people like themselves, hardworking, upstanding citizens. Once African Americans gained access to those same programs, conservatives realized that they could begin portraying these programs as nothing more than freebies being doled out to people of color. And they did this with dog whistles, coded terms that are still used to this day to evoke a very racialized picture about who is benefiting from our government programs. This got its start with Nixon, talking about states' rights and the need for law and order. And then a couple decades later, we have Ronald Reagan and the welfare queens. And then Democrats got in the game with Bill Clinton pledging to end welfare as we know it and that the era of big government was over. This strategy has been exceedingly effective. In 1964, 2 out of 3 whites voted for Lyndon Johnson, who pretty much embodied the principles of activist government, passing the Civil Rights Act and the programs of the Great Society. That was the last time the majority of whites would vote for the Democratic candidate for president. Now, we just lived through an election in which this strategy, frankly, it went from a whistle to a blowhorn, but it was effective. We find ourselves now 9 months into an administration that rose to power by playing on these fears, pitting us against each other. White against black, immigrant against citizen, Muslim against Christian, men against women. And also rode with the promise that was made to sort of the old white and male industrial class I've been talking about, that this country would again work for them. And this new working class was never part of that picture, never part of that promise. America wasn't ever envisioned to be great again for this new working class. But I want to be really clear about something. Unless this new working class reclaims economic and political authority once enjoyed by that blue-collar industrial class, or industrial working class people like my dad, anyone who isn't truly affluent will remain living on a precipice of economic anxiety and insecurity. So the big question remains, what can we do? That's like the $20 million question. And I'm going to leave you tonight with some hope, because I believe in the power of the people. I think we can do something about our broken democracy by unleashing the power of the people. It may seem right now that we are at a low point in terms of the power of the people. And yet, over the past several months, it has been people power through thousands and thousands of people marching and making phone calls and showing up at town halls that changed the direction of numerous policies that frankly seem destined to become law. So we need to use our people power to do things like recreate upward mobility in this country by getting back to the days of debt-free college. So it's possible to go to a public college or university, work a part-time job, leave in 4 years, and not have any debt. When we used to think of higher education as sort of this public good that benefited everybody, which is why the United States, among our people 60 to 80 years old, we have the best educated older population in the world. Best educated older population. We have the 11th best educated 20 and 30-year-old population. And I'm pretty sure that's not because Americans have gotten dumber. Instead, we've really walked away from our commitment to education, particularly our public system of higher education, as a public good, and instead fund it now more like healthcare, where it's a luxury for those who can afford it. But debt-free college is only one area of action. At the local and state level, we can push our policymakers to invest in people, rebuilding infrastructure, meeting the challenge of climate change, providing health care, all of the good stuff we all want, right? Like Republican, Democrat alike want this stuff. But it can't happen, and that brings me to the last thing we have to do, which is actually the first thing we have to do, is reclaim our democracy. We have got, thank you. We have got to make sure that everybody is registered and can vote. We have 46 million eligible Americans who are not registered to vote. There are unnecessary obstacles, many of them deliberate, such as requiring forms of ID, needless paperwork. If you move, your registration cannot follow you. So it may not be a surprise to some of you, but many of these barriers, and in fact, registration itself, we are actually the only democracy that requires people to register in order to be able to vote. And there are indeed very racist roots behind registration. So these policies, the new sort of era of voter suppression, are really aimed at keeping the new working class, people of color, young people, low-income people, from voting. We also have got to do something to ban the stranglehold, get rid of big money in our political system. Today, Congress spends 1 out of every 3 minutes they're in office fundraising. Think about that, 1/3 of their time fundraising. And that's not by talking to you and me, right? That's by not even close. And even, you all paid for this dinner, I'm assuming. They're not going to talk to the people who benefit from the great work of Just Harvest. Their attention is toward big donors. And it shows in the kinds of policies that actually make it onto the agenda. So we need to push for public financing of campaigns so that when a politician wants to run for office, they know they have to raise small amounts of money from a lot of ordinary individuals. Now, I know that seems like a pipe dream, but I want to lift up something pretty radical that happened in the pretty radical city of Seattle, but let's not discount it just because of that, where Seattle passed an initiative that for local city elections, every person in Seattle gets a democracy voucher worth $100 that they can donate to the candidates of their choice. So this is going to be the first election, but I am willing to bet that when that happens, and candidates now know that every person they talk to has $100 that potentially could fund their campaign, we're going to see people run on a different set of issues. And we're going to see a different set of people actually running. So it's possible. So I'm optimistic on a good day, but generally optimistic. And there's one reason, and that is that we are living through a time I never thought I'd live through of new activism and new movements. I used to have a baby boomer who, grew up with the anti-war activism, and, if there was a rally, he was at it. And I never could fully understand it. Now I get it, because I'm seeing new movements that are being led by working class people, by and for working class people, whether it's the Dreamers movement, or the Fight for 15, or Black Lives Matter. These are movements that are making a difference and calling all of us to do better. So I think the sleeping giant has awoken, and with the help of everybody in this room and millions of others, if we don't give up, if we hit the streets, pen the op-eds, run for office, and most importantly, vote, we can usher in a fairer and more just America for all of us. Thank you. Thank you.